Hello, this is Bethany. This is a pretty concise, description of color theory. It is a complex subject matter. By no means I don't want to feel like I'm dumbing this down for you. This is just an introduction to color. And as you proceed in your time as a designer or artist, of course, you're going to encounter all sorts of other things. But this is a lot of information gathered from books, websites, my own personal little bits of information thrown in here and there. And it's meant to just be a guide for some of you guys who are just beginning in color and really haven't experienced much of it yet, or just on a basic level as most human beings. Obviously, we deal with it every single moment, but thinking about it for compositions is a little bit different. And there's a lot of things that you know intuitively work. You've seen so much design in your life that you kind of already have a gist in your head, and you probably do things in a way that works really well. You just are unaware perhaps of some of the terms or the reasonings as to why. So keep this PDF handy, download it, keep it around. You'll want it around just as you proceed in your studies. So I'll go over some basic harmonies and then talk about the color wheels first, and just some of the interesting things about color. And this will get you going enough so that this is specifically for my digital foundations course, and these students will definitely, you all will have to refer to this for your project too, and onwards. All right, so I find one of the most annoying parts, and in some ways good parts, but it is more complicated, components, is that there's actually 3 different color wheels. This will frustrate some of you. Remember that you don't have to consider all 3 while you're making your decision processes, but you need to be aware of the existence of the others. So the first one is the traditional color wheel. This is what most people think of when they think of a color wheel, and this is it's pretty efficient. However, when it comes to certain colors, you can't actually get any color under the sun from this set. It's impossible because of the restrictions. And so I'm probably going to refer heavily to the additive and the subtractive. Probably more the subtractive than anything else. But I'll still come back to this. Like, even in my own head as a painter, in my head I'm actually seeing this. I just happen to substitute out a couple different hues, and I'll explain why. So everybody approaches color theory a little bit differently. I think every professor you have, you're going to get slightly shifting information, not like at its core, but the importance of what's good to learn first might be changing. But for me, you got to get this in your head first, because everything else follows it. So these are the 12 parts of a color wheel. You can of course subdivide them even further, but you need to know what your primary colors are. These are these ones that are on the larger sections of your color wheels. You need to know what the secondary colors are, which are either the slightly smaller ones, and then the tertiaries are in betweens. And I think all of us, we grew up understanding, like, if we mix red and yellow, we get orange. And so there's some really basic things. The problem is, in a lot of colors, if you want a really vivid purple, and you've been told to mix red with blue, like our terms of what red and blue are, you can't actually get a very vibrant purple. It's impossible. This color actually has yellow in it already. Red does. Our version of red, like fire engine red, stop sign red, it already has yellow in it. And so if you look at this, the opposite of yellow is violet, which means, which we'll learn later, if you want to desaturate a color or even make a brown, you mix its opposites. So this implies already that if it's got yellow in it, you're not going to be able to get a vibrant purple. It's going to dull it down. Anyway, this was one of the most frustrating things for me when I was trying to understand and learn about color. I'd work with it in class. It just was like so hard for me when I was in high school, because I was working on my own, and no matter what I was looking at, I could not get a good purple. And any other kind of blues, obviously, I think you understand, like, you're listed, like, where is this color blue in this? It's not here. Where is a really vibrant magenta? It's not here. And so you are gonna, if you use this in your head for a lot of things, that's great. But just know you're gonna have to actually also be aware of how these colors mix together, because you can get actually any color under the sun if you use these 3 primaries right here. Not these 3 primaries. These don't get you every color. These 3 do, if you mix them with white and black. So I'll get to that, but just know how that works. Now, The traditional color wheel is, I think, in a lot of ways just, there isn't a lot of vibrancy. This was more developed, this is how my brain interprets it. This is when we didn't have artificial colors. We didn't have a lot of weird chemical ways of making paints. These are more naturalistic. These aren't as intense. These aren't as vibrant. These are what nature just gives us on its own for mixing paints in a lot of ways. And so, in my opinion, this is why. The subtractive has really come into prominence with CMYK printing, which is cyan, which is this color, yellow, and then magenta. That's how we get printed materials. The machines that they use actually only use, in general, for the four-part color process, it's this blue, usually it's the yellow first, and then the blue, and then the magenta, and then followed by the black. And we don't need white because generally that is the color of the paper, right? Now if you're doing screen printing, you can include white as an actual color, but for normal printing you use the paper color as the white for mixing. So that's just the baseline of it. Additive. This is the one that honestly hurts my head because I am a painter. I think in mixing colors, not mixing light. And so for these ones, our brain will have a little bit more hard time with it. But it's basically if you overlay a red, so when I speak in additive, this means RGB. This is red, green, blue. Those are those three colors. Now, in terms of light, when you mix these together, then you get yellow, and so our brains aren't good with this because it doesn't understand how that works. But just know that on screen, like most of the things that we do, colors can be way more intensely vibrant. And so, you can get a lot of fluorescence. The core of these, a lot of them are super, super, really, really vibrant green, intense magenta, and so on and so forth. And so your cyan here is very, very, very fluorescent. So basically, in my head, if you see a lot of fluorescence on a color wheel, just think of it's an RGB, and it is an additive. And I think that kind of covers it. I'll definitely come back to this in a moment. So, color wheels, the original one, Sir Isaac Newton developed the first one a really long time ago, 1666. So you can kind of see how long we've been referencing this color wheel, which has been very helpful, of course, and we're going to continue to use it. I just feel like this is going to be better for you for mixing colors. Now, obviously on screen, we don't think of color mixing in the exact same way, but if you are going to be overlaying color, you're going to definitely need to understand this. So basically, yes, this one says, everything logically sequenced has merit, as long as they're talking about pure hues here. Now, what I want you to notice is that there are no desaturated colors. There's nothing that's dark. There's nothing that's really light. These are pure hues. And, each of them have their own applications. Just remember that. So you might go back and forth between them, especially those of you in design. You'll definitely probably be shifting back and forth as needed. So the traditional color wheel, it is, we've talked about this already, but your primary colors, these are the large areas. When you mix these primaries together, you will get something close to a really dark brown. Not black, but this is just like the core. Everything has black at some point. If you need to mix any colors, you probably could use black. But you can also, as you do more color theory, you're gonna, and you're a painter, you probably avoid using black most of the time. So basically, this is saying if you mix two primaries, which are equidistant from each other on the color wheel, you will get your secondary color. If you mix your secondary color with the primary, you get a tertiary color, so a red-orange and an orange. If you mix the orange with a yellow, you get a yellow-orange, so on and so forth. So basically, the tertiaries are a mix, their names are a mix of the primary and the secondary. So we've got red, we've got violet, in the middle we've got red-violet. We've got violet, we've got blue, in the middle we've got blue-violet. Blue, green, we've got green-blue, or blue-green, however you want to say it. And then yellow-green because of the mix. So that's the kind of terms that you would want to know. And then when it comes to normal color names, you guys know the coloring, you open up a Crayola coloring box and there's all kinds of names on them, right? We don't do that in this class as much. There's a lot of terms like pastels. We don't use that term anymore. We're going to use the term tints. We'll get to that in a little bit. RGB system. Okay, so this is that one that I said hurts my head. Sure, it will hurt a lot of you guys, but that's because our eyes don't interpret things the same way as screens do. So they're light primaries. This is how you were working with them. This is basically how it works. So color in TVs, computer monitors, the screen you're looking at right now, whatever it is. When you mix them together, they're different than everything else. You actually mix it to white. All the other ones with that black circle in the middle, if you mix things together, you get a darker color. When you mix these colors together, you actually get white. So it's the same idea, but it is a little bit different. I think the big thing for us to take away from this is the colors in here are going to be, our screens are capable of producing much more vibrant colors than you can in printed matter or painted matter, typically, unless you're using a really synthetic color. We can get and you can buy fluorescents, right? But overall, this is just the way to think about it. The RGB or the additive system is going to be for screen use that you can, just think about. But even when you're processing things about color in your head, you still might be thinking about this particular one. So this attractive is my go-to for painting. It saved me, once I figured this stuff out, everything was easy for painting. So you can call this attractive system. You can also call it the process colors because, again, they are referring to the process of commercial printing. But even in your own your own inkjets at home, the color cartridges that you put in are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Some of you guys might also have an additional sixth. Sometimes they will do blue and green, like this blue and this green. Sometimes they'll put in this red. So sometimes they'll put the secondary colors along with it, but not all of you guys will have that. It's kind of like an upgrade version for color printers at home. So you are already familiar with how this works. Even if you've done not true commercial printing on giant presses, you're still doing, on inkjet, you're doing the same thing. And again, I don't find that if you mix these three primaries together, you honestly get a true black. You get a dark color, but it's not true black. So the primaries on this one are the cyan, which is the blue, magenta, and yellow. Secondary colors, when you mix these, they are different than the traditional color wheel, because now if you mix these two together, that's when you actually get a red. It's mostly pink, or excuse me, mostly magenta with just a tiny bit of yellow, but that equals red. These are not, when you're mixing colors by painting, you do not mix these equally. If you mix an equal amount of blue and green, sometimes you'll get a decent, you might need to, basically don't count on these as being equal proportions, okay? So if you take a lot of yellow, add a little bit of blue, you will get green. If you take a lot of blue and you add a little bit of yellow, you'll get a blue-green. So it's a little confusing in that spot, but just know, in some way, if you mix the primaries, you'll get your secondaries, and that's a really important thing to note. I think from where you get the primaries and the secondaries, the tertiaries make perfect sense. It's just that it's a little bit different than the traditional. So color physics, this is really important stuff to understand now. Hue. When I say hue, I mean pure unadulterated color. That means there's no white added, there's no black added, there's no brown added, there's no gray added. It's just pure color with pure color. So, I could have any kind of color. If I subdivided this even further and had it like 20-part color wheel, like in between each section, each of those would still be a pure hue because nothing has been added to them other than color. Now, past that, we get, we consider where we're shifting the value. So try to remember these different words. I will try to only use these in class. Now, when we talk about color, though, think about it. If you're like, what color did you just paint your living room? Like, oh, it's kind of like a, like a light, like a light blue, maybe a little bit of gray. Like you try to find and search for words that are describing to them a color enough so that they get a color in their head, right? Or you'd be like, well, here's an image, but the color's a little bit off. It's more like it's got a little bit of green in it. And so we really search for terms that work. Now, if you use these terms that we're going to be learning here, it will help a little bit. Now, the problem is, though, that the general public has no idea about these terms. They're also poorly used in the industry and misused in industry, so that everything gets watered down. And really, if you're talking to a person that understands color theory, you can use these terms to your heart's content. If you're talking to somebody else, good luck. You're going to have to reword yourself back to how you used to talk in order to be able to have them understand what you're saying. I wish that from kindergarten on up, color was taught properly, because it would make a huge difference. Now, the next component then is we're just going to walk through what these are. So we've got tint. I probably should have made these a little bit bigger, but a tint is a pure color, and again, this pure color could be anything along these color wheels, these 12-part color wheels, and anything in between, like a tiny little slice, like a blue added with a blue with a, a subsection here. Could be any one of those kinds of colors could be on this starting end. So this is like a yellow-orange. As you add white, it gets lighter. Okay, so a tint is lighter. You add white. Tone is when you add a gray. So these two bottom ones, both of these are tones. Okay, you can get the tones are more complicated in my opinion, because for a shade you add black. Period. Nothing fancy about that. Nothing fancy about the white ones. It's just you either add a lot of white or you add some dark or a lot of dark. Usually you don't need much black to affect the color. However, tones can make a light value, a medium value, or a dark value. Right here I only listed two, right? But because you can have a light gray and all the way up to a medium gray and then down to a dark gray. Okay, so your tones will vary drastically. If you have a super light gray that you added something to, it's probably going to look more like a tint. There's a point in which it starts to actually get a little bit of a dirtier color, like it's affecting the color more than just making it look light. It's it's changing it. I usually think of it in terms of it is kind of dirtying it down. It is desaturating it. It is not only making it lighter or darker, it's actually desaturating it. Like there's less color as you move through all the different variations of a tone. Now I'm going to open up Photoshop here just because I think it makes sense for those of us who are using screens. I'm going to open up the color picker. And this is how I think it makes sense for people. So up here we have pure hue, like really vibrant, unadulterated color. All right. Anything along this top bar, all the way running across, that is a tint. Okay. Anything up at the top, all the way up to white, that's just white. Now it's a tint. And all the way through, it's a tint, tint, tint. Now, as you get closer to its pure source, it kind of, maybe that doesn't look like a tint. Like if it's really close to pure color, it's going to be hard. That kind of looks like a lighter yellow. There's a point in which your brain interprets it as, oh, that's lighter. It kind of knows that this is pure. That's kind of close to pure. That's too close to pure. All of a sudden now my brain is like, yep, that's a lighter one. So now all the way down the other side is your shades. So apologies, I should have turned off all my Facebook stuff. So black, obviously that's black, 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 black. Here, depending on what we have else on the page, it might still look like black. And finally it starts to look more like an actual, like an olive, right? So those of you guys who are, messing up your yellows, you don't get a dark yellow by adding black. You actually get a dark yellow by adding brown, or its opposite of purple, or anything around purple. So, there you go for those of you guys who mix color and always getting the wrong yellow. But I think it's important to note that. So, here we're like, okay, that's a little bit darker yellow. Darker yellow, definitely. Now it looks like olive, okay? But technically this is a shade of yellow. Gets a little bit complicated, right? Now, here's the other situation. So right after white, we're getting into the grays. So anything essentially that's radiating out at an angle to the gray area, that's a tone. So anything, all All of these are technically tones. All the way until as you get too close to black, all right, your brain will start to interpret them in the same way probably as a shade. Same thing here, like here, I don't know, I think our brain probably interprets that pretty quickly as like a off-white. In my mind, an off-white is a tone. Like that color right there. That's a tone. But if you get too close, it's like, well, if it's isolated and all by itself, your brain might just be like, well, that's a light yellow. But as soon as you tick down enough, then your brain's like, no, that's off-white. So we're pretty sensitive, and that's a good thing. But again, naming things can be complicated. In my examples, I'll try to be pretty overt and not tricky, just like really overly obvious for midterms. But and I think in your stuff too, you might want to be a bit more obvious. But anyway, just so you know, that's a really good way to think about color when in terms of the color picker, if you're dealing with Adobe products and you're using the color picker in particular. All right, so now let's go back to this. I hope all that makes sense. So just remember, we got tints. This stuff's definitely going to be on the midterm. Tints means you're adding white. Tones means you're adding gray, either dark gray, medium gray, or light gray. And then shade is if you add black. I think shade's probably the easiest one to think about, because if you're under a tree and you see the grass difference between grass that's in the light and grass that's underneath the shade, there's a difference. It's darker. So this one's pretty easy to understand. Saturation equals intensity. And so, you know, you can say it's a really intense blue, like beautiful, bright. If you're talking about like a good bright day outside. And if you're like, no, it's kind of like a really dark, cloudy, usually means gray, meaning a tone. Just watch your terms, and hopefully they'll help you make sense of which ones you're actually meaning in terms of tints, tones, and shades. But we use intense quite a bit to describe color. I don't think that non-art people usually use concentrated very often, but technically it is referring to the purity of the color, like how much real pure color is in there and how much of these other things are we adding to it. So you now see like these are the more specific way to make variation in value. There's one other one, and that's by using the hues complement, and we're going to get to that in just a minute as we move into the color schemes. So just as a quick reference to that though, that means on these color wheels, I'm going to go up to the first page, that if you don't want to desaturate a color by using black, gray, or white, you think of using its opposite or near opposite. So again, you got to bring up in your head these color wheels. I don't find them as effective for this for the additive. I think normally, sorry, and this also will frustrate some people, but I usually will say the subtractive kind of works, but in my mind, most of the time, the traditional color works for desaturating your color. So basically, as a really quick thing, if you want to desaturate a red, then you add a little bit of green. If you want to make a purple seem closer to brown, you add a little bit of yellow. Basically, you can get closer to brown or make something feel a little bit more of a dirty version of itself, like you added mud, meaning that dirty, by adding its opposite. And it will pretty much work here as well, but occasionally it doesn't, it's just a little bit out of alignment. So in general, when you're referring to these color schemes, to be honest, they work better if you're thinking about the traditional. This works well if you're thinking about mixing colors. This works best if you're thinking about opposites and how to make your color schemes, which this is what we'll get into now. Okay, so basic color schemes. I think most of us, there's no surprise, I didn't even bother doing a color wheel for this one because it's a monochromatic color scheme, meaning one. So that means any of a pure color, anywhere along this color wheel, any of them, any of all three of them, plus its values. So, you know, a tint of a blue, a tone of a blue, maybe 5 different kinds of tones of a blue, plus some shade variations, like all of those ones would be monochromatic. So any one color. Okay, now this doesn't mean you do a little bit of a different kind of green and a little bit of another kind of green. That's not monochromatic anymore. That means you stick to simply one kind of color, plus you do the whites, the grays, and the blacks added to it. Or you could, of course, also use the its complement to make another desaturated version of itself. It will change it quite a bit. It's different. You'll see there's a richness attached to adding a complement. It's a little bit more flat, I guess in some ways I would say, a little bit less rich if you just use whites, blacks, and grays. Now, I should have probably moved this down. I'm going to talk about analogous second. Analogous means that you look at the color wheel and you choose 3 colors, up to 5, but there's a complicated little part in here. Basically, when you're looking at a color wheel and you want an analogous, let's say that you kind of like the idea of a monochromatic, but you need a little bit more richness, you need some variety. So, for example, if I choose this blue-violet, but I'm like, yeah, but I need more. Like, just doing the lights and the darks isn't enough. I need a little bit more variety. So then you can go over here and you can do the other blue. And you can also do the violet. Now, you can do up to 5, but it depends on where you're at on the color wheel. The rule with this one is that you don't go to 2 primaries. You can only use 1 primary. Or I should say, like, primaries, and it's, you know, closer to its real color. So that means if I wanted to include this color, but I wanted more, I could do this color, this color, this color, this color, and I can do 4. Okay. If I, you know, I'd say probably 4 is your safest bet when it comes to analogous, because you'll never hit 2 primaries if you're doing 4. If you add a little bit more, like if you went into the blue-green, that's kind of pushing it a little bit too far in terms of analogous. It's making it a little bit, yeah, it's just more. So I think the safest thing is to do 2 or 3 color, or excuse me, 3 or 4 if you're going for an analogous color scheme. Some people will say that if you're using 2 primaries, you've gone too far and it's no longer an analogous. The other way to think about it is that you will always either be in the warms or in the cools. It's rare that you're going to be utilizing both sets if you're doing an analogous color thing. Now we'll look at the warm and the cool in a little bit, but just as a really quick version, basically warm cools are anything that include a lot of red or a lot of yellow. So even this yellow-green, and under most contexts, would be considered a warm color. And the magenta would probably be considered more of a warm color. But when you get over to violet, it's got enough blue in it that most people would consider that a cool. So green, though, for most people, that would be considered a cool color over on here. But if you use green in the right way and under the right circumstances with other colors, like if you mix green with blue and you say which one's warmer, most people are going to say the green is because it's got more yellow. So it's kind of based on context and what else you're using, colors like that. But for the most part, if it has a lot of blue, it's probably a cool color. If it has a lot of yellow and red, or red, it is probably a warm color. All right, so I'm moving over to the triptych, or triple, excuse me, or you can call it the triadic. Usually people say triple because it's easier. Again, depending on what color wheel you're using, you can make sense of that in another way. But for the most part, I'm using the subtractive, as you can see. I've labeled it here. If you use cyan, blue, and magenta, excuse me, I said that wrong. Cyan, yellow, and magenta, you are going to have a triple. Now, take that idea of this, you know, these all have to be equidistant from each other if you're doing the triple. So anything that where you can shift over the equidistant would be, so basically then it could be blue, green, orange, or violet. So anything that you, basically if you imagine these 3 and you twist them, as long as they're hitting 3 and they're equidistant, you've got a triple color scheme. So this is pretty rich. It's pretty wide. It allows you to have cools and warms. And also, when you're doing these color schemes, proportion you can throw out the window. You could have this tiniest sliver of yellow, a ton of blue, and just a little bit of pink, and that would still be considered a triple. You don't have to have equal amounts of color of any of these in order for them to be considered their schemes. And sometimes it's actually hard to name a scheme properly, even if someone's done it properly, if the colors that they've used are so desaturated, like super light colors or super dark colors, that your brain has a little bit of time trying to figure it out. If we have a lot of pure color, it's usually easier to spot, but you can really desaturate something super quietly, so that it becomes a little bit more difficult for somebody to figure out. And that's fine. As long as in the end I know that your source colors were, you know, 3 that were equidistant and you're trying for this triple, then you've succeeded. Complementary colors. This is the one where I was saying if you want desaturated colors, if you're doing actually mixing of paints or overlaying colors on top of each other, The complements are what you want to go with. So complements in this situation mean they're directly opposite each other. This is not complement. Keep that in mind. That's not an I, that's an E. They complement each other, even though they're opposite. Now, sports teams love complementary colors. I mean, think about what a lot of them are doing, especially if you refer to probably more like the traditional color wheel. Then they're really like, we see a lot of blue and yellows, purples and yellows. We do see a lot of just yellows and blues and things like that too, but we do tend to like, sports teams like bright kind of colors that fight each other is what a lot of them are using. So complementary colors can fight each other in a really strong way, but a quick way to remedy that if you want something a little bit less intense would simply be to desaturate one or both of the colors. So if you had a really bright blue, but you don't want the yellows to be so, you maybe use more golds instead, or maybe use really lighter blues and add some whites. Anywhere along those, as long as the core element in your color choices would be yellow and blue in this instance, then no matter how difficult, there might not even be a pure color that you use. Maybe they're all desaturated somehow. It's still a complementary system. Split complement is very close. It just allows you to add another color in there by being very close to complement. But you actually, instead of taking the true opposite of a color, you take the two on either side of it. So in this case, you can see I've used yellow and blue as its idea, but instead I took this blue and this violet, which are on other sides of that. Essentially, it's a blue-violet right here. And that works out. So I took blue, I took violet, still pretty darn close. If I wanted to take this blue-violet right here and move it across, and instead of using yellow, I would use yellow, green, and orange. And again, when you're doing this, you kind of got to remember you can use either this one or this one. You can try this one. I don't think it's quite as effective when you're talking about these different color harmonies, because the color harmonies were built upon the traditional color wheel. Okay, so I'm using the subtractive here because I use a lot, but again, for your knowledge base, just know that it's traditional probably would work very effectively, but you can use the subtractive if you want to. Moving on down, the next and last one that are some of the basic ones are the double complement, and that means in the same way that you could take a set opposite each other here, for the double complement you simply choose two sets, and they can be anywhere along them. So for example, instead of if I wanted this blue, violet, and yellow, but I wanted something a little bit more, I could also just use the blue and the orange. So as long as there's two sets, it doesn't matter how far apart they are in the color wheel, how close they are, as long as they are four colors that include their opposites, you're good. Contrast and dominance, this is an important component of color. There's so many different ways to consider. I'm going to go through this very quickly because most of us is like, yeah, duh. We get it. We've known this for all our lives in a way that, again, you might not use the terms, but you just know it. So contrast of warm and cool, again, think about that being a way to do some color contrast. Most people assume when you need color contrast that you need something really dark and you need something really light, but that's not the case. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So contrast of warm and cool, that's an easy one to do. And remember, you could use like a cool color in its pure unadulterated form with a warm color that's maybe desaturated, and it'll still count. Contrast of saturation, this is a little bit it's basically just you could have something that's really pure color along with a bunch of stuff that's desaturated and of different values. Maybe most of them are dark, and then a really light tint, and then a pure color. Even if you just used a really light and a really, well, usually this one would be more about saturation. The next one is the contrast of light and dark, which again is what most people will consider contrast to be, but it's, you have a really super light tint and then you get a really dark shade. That would be the juxtaposition of the light and dark, and you can use this in any of those color schemes. Contrast of extension, I feel like, I don't know. I mean, it's here. I listed it because it's in the books, but it's about proportion. So if you want something to be more about a dark palette, then you use more dark colors and only a little bit of a lighter one. yeah, there's not, I mean, we're always doing this no matter what we do. If we got more than 2 colors, we're thinking about proportions. Or if we have at least 2 colors or 2 values. If we have only 1 color, 1 value, it's just a plain color field. There's nothing else. At the moment you add another shape or with a different value, you immediately have extension or proportion. Contrast of complements, we went through that. That's thinking about their opposites. Simultaneous contrast, this is an interesting one. This is when colors can kind of vibrate against each other. Like if you have a pure orange against a pure blue, it's really difficult sometimes for your eyes to focus, especially if it's screen based where there's a lot of light coming through it. Normally it's only when your colors are really their most vibrant, like they're pure hue. Others, as soon as you desaturate something, they become easier to distinguish between the two of them. Contrast of hue, as soon as you got more than 1 color somewhere, even at different values, doesn't matter. This is not talking about pureness here, just 2 to like an orange and a yellow orange. You immediately have a contrast of hue. They're not the same thing. So again, most of these are pretty much common sense, but I want you to understand the names of them. Now another interesting thing here is talking about high and low key. We don't really talk about it a lot. I think we probably maybe use that term in photography a bit more, but you can use it in design and painting as well. A high key composition is about light. You can still have contrast and it can still be satisfying image, but there's a point in which you do not use any dark colors. You can go all the way to a medium value. Okay, so I'm going to open up Photoshop again in the color picker. So when you talk about like a medium value, it's basically this guy right here. Up and down the gray bar, this is middle. So again, if you're here, if you're here, that to me feels darker. But anywhere probably along here to here, like our brains will interpret that as middle value. True middle is right there, of course. So anything that is, just know that if you're like, it's not dark, it's not light, it's middle then. So go ahead and use that term. So, you know, and sometimes if you add a middle, it might be too much. Maybe it does add too much contrast, but this is like a pretty good definition of a high key. And this is a low key. This one has no light color. So it basically goes everything from where the high key will basically choose anything up here. Here you kind of get a little, that's fine. So basically, you know, if you think about this line right in the middle, technically anything above it is a high key, and technically anything below it is a low key. So if you've never tried that before in a composition, you may want to give it a go. Now this one definitely uses a couple different things. It's maybe not using the contrast of light and dark as heavily as a normal composition, but it still is using it. There's a black, there's you know, some really dark stuff along with a really lighter thing, but it's also about contrast of saturation, because we got a really brightly saturated thing, pure hue, along with a variation of all sorts of different values underneath it. So that one here is probably a really good, also a really good example of the contrast of saturation. Color behavior, this one gets pretty complex. We are going to be doing some, those of you in my digital foundations class, we're going to be doing some exercises with these things, but I just wanted to give you a quick view of this. So color will change itself on you depending on what background it has. There's a thing we're going to be working with called ground subtraction. That might freak a few of you out, but it's a pretty fun thing to utilize. It's where a color, if you understand color theory, and it's mostly set about the opposites, if you use a complement in a background, it's going to push its opposite. So there's some really interesting things that can happen. So the first thing you should know is that if you have a color on a dark background, it's immediately going to look lighter than what you intended. And that might be okay with you, but you might have to make some adjustments with this color. Like if you didn't want this color to feel so vibrant, you're going to have to darken it a little bit in order to be able to like look normal against the black. If you want, like now this, keep in mind, this red is exactly the same in every single one of these. This is the same color, but you don't see it as the same color. This red looks darker than this one, and it's because anything on a light background or white will look darker. This, when it's on a color that includes its, trying to think here. I'm gotta look at my screen to make sure it's actually doing it for me. I'm hopefully doing it for you. When I look at this one and this one, what I do is I focus my eye right in the middle here. your brain might be able to pick up that if I had to describe the differences between these two, I would say that this red feels more orange and this one feels a little bit more blue. Like it feels like a slightly colder red. And that's because this orange here is basically sucked up the orange from the red. It's really, that's ground subtraction right here. This one, however, it's pushing. So when I look at this one, it's almost like vibrating. It feels extra saturated. Like if I focus my eye right here and I'm looking at this one and this one at the same time, this one feels way more intense. There's even like a little weird line around it, and that is the simultaneous contrast happening because we took two opposites. We took this red against this cyan, and it is basically vibrating. It's also the fact that the complement immediately pushes its opposite, so it's really forcing the red to just like vibrate. There's really no other great way to think about it. So you can either suck a color out or you can push a color. And it's two different ways to think about it. So you can subtract color out or add color. And again, it's all based on the background color, sometimes by proportion as well. Active and passive, we talked a little bit about the warms and cools, so this is just a little graphic I found online, but it's not amazing, but it kind of gives you the idea here. The active colors tend to be, you know, reds and yellows, and passive is normally considered this, but in my mind that's only when these two are used in conjunction with each other. If you're really focusing, let's say, on just an analogous color palette, the passive range would be the darker colors and the more pure color would be considered the active. So it's just dependent on your color use, but in general the actives are the warms and the cools are the passives. And so that's it as far as getting you going. It's going to be lots of weird little things that happen based on your color choices, but overall what you might need to do is, if you have a photograph with a lot of color, you can use some color adjustments to get it to go. Let's say you wanted a monochromatic with blue, you just use a color overlay or hue saturation or something to switch that photograph to blue, and then all of your other elements will be blue based, if that makes sense. So that's it in a nutshell. Contact me if you need more help, but I hope that this is a good spot for you to begin. So the first thing for those of you doing the project 2 for digital foundations, you must first decide what is your color set going to be, and that's based mostly on what you want your composition to be. Is it for somebody who loves orange? Okay, well maybe it could be, instead of just being monochromatic, maybe most of the color could be orange, but you could also use some red oranges and some yellow oranges. If you want it strictly orange, that's fine, that'd be monochromatic. Or if you're like, well, I really love orange, but I want it to be a bit more vibrant than that. Okay, well then include a little bit of a blue. It could be a majority of orange, and then it would be a complementary system instead. So you can talk to me about what your intent could be. I might be able to help you figure out which one would be best for you. But yep, that's it for now.